Dear listeners, before we start today's episode, a quick announcement. Tomorrow morning, we will publish a special episode of the Indian Express podcast brought to you by the British Council, where Indian Express's Charulata Biswas will be in conversation with Debanjan Chakrabarti, Director East and Northeast India, British Council, about studying in the UK universities, scholarship opportunities, and the role of the British Council in helping international students in the UK. So don't forget to tune in tomorrow at 11 a.m. Now, on with the show.
Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Today we're bringing you an episode that we had first published last year in June, nearly 10 months back. And this is because there has been an update to the story. And by that we mean that even more things have been removed from school textbooks. So we'll play you the original version first and then give you the latest update. Over the years, different governments have attempted to change school textbooks based on their political ideology and what they think children should and should not learn. And every time such changes are made, they're talked about and debated in the news.
First, the title, The Great, was removed from Akbar's name. Then Nehru was nearly erased from the Class 8 textbook. And now the new Class 10 textbook is given a larger-than-life role to Savarkar, while Mahatma Gandhi is merely a passing reference.
They've dropped chapters about democracy and diversity, the rise of Islamic empires in Afro-Asian territories, the chronicles of Mughal courts, and poems by Urdu poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz.
And when asked about the rationale behind the choice of topics or chapters being dropped, media reports say that officials maintain that these changes are all part of the rationalization of the syllabus and that they are in alignment with the recommendations by the National Council of Educational Research and Training, or the NCERT.
Now, things like these have been happening in the past. But recently, the NCERT undertook an exercise under which it has made extensive changes in school textbooks. Now, NCERT is an autonomous organization under the Government of India, which is in charge of drafting school curriculum and school textbooks. And the changes that it has recently made have been the most sweeping changes since the NDA government, led by the BJP, came to power in 2014. This is what a recent Indian Express investigation has found out. From deleting references to the 2002 Gujarat riots and dropping passages that dealt with the emergency, to removing chapters on protests and social movements, including those headed by the Narmada Bachao Andolan and the Dalit Panthers. And this was all part of another text rationalization exercise which was started 6 months ago.
This is around the time when NCERT did not have a full-time head.
That's Ritika Chopra, Indian Express's national education editor, who undertook this investigation.
The acting head of that time, Sridhar Srivastav, he started this exercise. He sent out a letter to all the departments within the NCERT.
This letter talked about rationalizing textbooks of the NCERT.
What we mean by rationalized textbooks is that they decided to reduce curriculum load. And they justified this on the ground that it's been 2 years since the pandemic struck and schools have been closed for a while, and that kids have lost a lot of learning as well as time during this time. And in order to help students out, it was best that NCERT reduce curriculum load. The idea was to delete content in order to reduce curriculum load.
The reasoning was that because learning could not take place properly during COVID, children needed to catch up, and so the syllabus and textbooks should be reduced to help them out. But what is interesting to note is that the government was actually planning to reduce school curriculum even before COVID. In 2018, the then Education Minister Prakash Javadekar had announced that school curriculum will be reduced by 50%.
एक्सपीरियंशियल लर्निंग की जरूरत है, हाथ से काम करने की जरूरत है, लाइफ स्किल एजुकेशन की जरूरत है, फिजिकल एजुकेशन की जरूरत है, लेकिन किसी के लिए भी स्कूल में समय नहीं मिलता क्योंकि करिकुलम का बोझ इतना है कि उससे स्टूडेंट उभरता ही नहीं। और इसलिए हमने एक फैसला किया कि करिकुलम आधा कम करेंगे और आने वाले 2 साल में हम करिकुलम कम करेंगे ताकि ये सारा समय इन सभी अच्छे कामों के लिए मिलेगा।
which frankly at that point sent even alarm bells ringing within the NCERT. They said, look, it's not as if our textbooks are pretty lean as it is. And they felt it wasn't possible to bring the content down by half. Then they didn't really put a percentage to it. They said, no, we are going to rationalize curriculum. And in 2019 also, I did stories on chapters that were dropped.
This time, however, the changes that were made by the NCERT were so sweeping that Ritika, as a journalist, felt that there was a need to document it thoroughly. And so, as part of an Indian Express investigation, she scrutinized 21 current history, political science, and sociology textbooks for classes 6 to 12.
When I started out, I was also a little overwhelmed with how many changes were made, and this was across subjects. So then we decided to stick to social science because that is something that the BJP has been in controversies for. So we said, fine, we will take political science, history, sociology, these three subjects, and we will look at these three subjects across classes, from classes 6 to 12. And we did it as a project because, like I said, because of the scale of changes that were made in the textbooks. I haven't seen this at least in a decade.
Now, going through all these textbooks took some time, and she says that the process was less than exciting.
Frankly, I'm not a big fan of reading school textbooks. I can't tell you how often I've dozed off during this exercise. It was very painful on that front. Also, it isn't as simple as just matching a table carrying changes with the actual text and then just making a list of those changes. You actually have to end up reading the entire textbook, almost all chapters, because you also have to be very fair. You can't just list out changes which may have actually been covered very extensively in the same class in another textbook.
And so she went through all the social science textbooks. And while going through them, she found some changes that did not really make sense if the idea was to reduce the burden on children. Like, sure, some entire chapters were removed during this exercise, but in many places only a couple of sentences were removed, and in other places only a few words.
So to give you one example, in the class 6 history textbook, R Pass 1, that's the name of the textbook, in chapter 6 of that textbook, there's a very small section called ashramas in it. In a sense, in that section, they describe, what were the 4 stages of life as defined by the priests during the Vedic period. And in that section, there is just this one sentence, and I'm reading out that sentence to you, is that the system of ashramas allowed men to spend some part of their lives in meditation. Generally, women were not allowed to study the Vedas, and they had to follow the ashramas chosen by their husbands. So they have dropped this specific portion out, just these 2 sentences in particular. To give you another example, so this is again in that same textbook, and this is a section on Puranas. And the original sentence, I'm reading out the original sentence, it said the Puranas were written in simple Sanskrit verse and were meant to be heard by everybody, including women and Shudras, who were not allowed to study the Vedas. Now, the new sentence basically just ends at everybody. So the new sentence has essentially left out the bit which said including women and Shudras, who were not allowed to study the Vedas. So I don't know, frankly, what purpose that serves, because it's very selective in terms of the information it's left out, which is that women and Shudras were not allowed to study the Vedas.
So as you can see, just removing these few words does not make sense if you actually wanted to reduce the syllabus.
And there are many examples like this of 2 or 3 sentences, or like even portions of sentences being revised and dropped. I got more and more curious during this exercise when I realized the nature of changes. As apart from the scale, it was eventually the nature of changes. And then we kind of started spotting certain patterns. They all were we felt that there were many changes which were fitting certain themes. And maybe these are themes where people or other politicians from the party in power had spoken about.
And so she started putting all the changes in an Excel sheet, organizing them in columns and searching for patterns. And one area where she found a lot of cuts being made was the content related to protests and social movements.
If you ask me, except for one chapter in the class 12 sociology textbook, there is almost nothing now on protests which turned into social movements from classes 6 to 12. they have dropped 3 whole chapters. These textbooks, at least in social sciences, in the NCERT textbooks, were pretty focused on social movements. So they've virtually removed everything that there was with reference to social movements in political science from classes 6 to 12. Thoda bahut jo bacha hai, it's left in the class 12 sociology textbook, and which I should mention even now that even that chapter, that one chapter that's left, even there they have made a lot of changes and they've tried to reduce content of that. So that really stood out for me. And these were essentially, when I say protests and social movements, I'm saying these are protest social movements which happened post-independence.
So political movements like the one that was started by the Dalit Panthers, the famous Chipko movement, and even the agrarian struggle which was headed by the Bharatiya Kisan Union. Apart from this, Ritika also found that 2 references to the 2002 Gujarat riots were also removed. And more interestingly, references to the emergency were also removed.
Not entirely, to be fair, but there is a chapter on emergency in the class 12 political science textbook. And they have removed the bit that specifically talks about why the emergency was controversial and why it was wrong and what are the excesses that were committed by the Indira Gandhi government around that time. So basically excesses like arrest of political workers, restrictions on media, torture, custodial deaths, forced sterilization campaign. It talks about all of that. So, I mean, these are just a couple of things, and I realized that a lot of these things that had been removed were pertaining to contemporary India, in the sense India post-independence, and it made sense to group all of that in the first part. So, the first part essentially spoke about Gujarat riots, the emergency, content deleted on protests and social movements, and content pertaining to democracy. There are 4 chapters. I mean, I must say these textbooks are pretty focused on democracy as well. So, they've dropped 4 chapters from classes 6 to 12 on democracy.
She says that the reasoning that is now being given by the NCERT is that chapters, say on democracy, were dropped from classes 6 and 7 is because the topic has been covered extensively in classes 9 and 10.
But let's not forget, when people make textbooks, the idea is to build on concepts. So even when you're reading the NCERT textbooks, and I would know this since I've done multiple readings, is that they keep referring to these concepts which were introduced in junior classes, if I can call it that, where they say that, look, in class 6, if you remember, you had read about democracy, but now we will take this up in detail, where we will not just talk about democracy, but we'll tell you how democracy and equality work together, or how democracy and diversity work together. Like that. So the idea is to introduce concepts at a younger age, and then you eventually build on them in higher classes. Pedagogically, sometimes it will not make sense to just completely remove a concept from a younger class on the ground that, look, we're talking about in class 9 and 10.
Like in the case of mathematics, you would not remove subtraction from class 4 and 5 just because students will be using it in algebra later on. Now, another curious thing that Ritika found during her investigation was that there was only a single mention of sedition in the political science and history textbooks from classes 6 to 12.
Because I checked. I went through all these textbooks with a fine-tooth comb to see if sedition was mentioned anywhere. And there was just one mention of sedition, and this was in the class 8 political science textbook in a chapter titled Understanding Laws. Frankly, this is not dealt with in detail, but yes, there is a very small section in which, when they're describing how arbitrary British colonial laws were, so they cite sedition as an example of it. And in that, there is also a very small exercise for students. Like I mentioned, that there are many exercises in these textbooks, which makes them kind of interactive, and very small exercise under the section which asks students to give one reason why you think the Sedition Act of 1870 was arbitrary, and in what way does the Sedition Act contradict the rule of law. So that has also been removed. I thought it was important to just flag that, especially that this was the only mention. So now by removing this, essentially, I don't think students would read this anywhere in any other class or any other textbook.
But apart from contemporary politics and social movements, it turns out a lot of content related to caste has also been removed now.
Like, very curiously, I said few sentences dropped here and there, which again wouldn't make sense from the point of view of reduction of curriculum load. To give you, for instance, just one example. So in the class 6 history textbook, R past 1 again, there is a section on Varnas. They're introducing Varnas to kids in this class. And here they have reduced this section almost like they pulled out the paragraph which describes the hereditary nature of Varnas. Basically, that it's a birth-based system. That it eventually came to be defined as something which was hereditary.
And this is something she says finds a lot of echo in the right-wing ecosystem. A lot of people, especially those belonging to forward caste, insist that the Varnas or the caste system was not a bad thing, and it was mainly done keeping in mind division of labor. And it is not the systematic form of oppression that it always has been.
Then there are, interestingly, at least I spotted 4 specific examples in the class 12 sociology textbook. These were essentially examples that demonstrate how untouchability works. For instance, just to read out one sentence from the class 12 sociology textbook, Indian Society, there is a sentence which they have dropped which states that a Dalit is likely to be confined to traditional occupations such as agricultural labor, scavenging or leather work with little chance of being able to get high-paying white-collar or professional work. This is one sentence that they dropped. There is one passage from Harsh Mandar's book. There is this book he had written, Unheard Voices, Stories of Forgotten Lives, a passage in which he describes the ordeal of a Dalit manual scavenger. Her name is Narayanamma. So that has been dropped. So yeah, there were a few other references which of course we've mentioned, but like I said that, these were specific paragraphs that were being dropped, which again did not make sense to me from the point of view of repetition or having been covered elsewhere. These weren't chapters or big chunks being dropped, but these seemed a little selective in nature, these changes.
Now, so far we have talked about references to modern political events and caste being dropped. But the other broad pattern of deletions that Ritika found were related to the Mughal history section. Leaders within the BJP have regularly talked about how Indian history glorifies the Mughal Empire and does not talk enough about other rulers. And this has been reflected in what has been deleted from these textbooks.
To be honest, this was the least surprising bit of the project for me. I mean, when this came up, I was like, oh, okay, it was a very obvious basket and I put it in that. Unlike, like I said, for me, writing part 1 and 2 was more revelatory, I think, personally for me. I mean, part 3 sort of came easy because this is something that the current regime has just been harping on for years now. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there seems to be a lot of noise about it in the last 1 year at least, even in the last few months. I mean, even this month, the Home Minister, I think he was speaking at a book launch where he again made a reference to how our history doesn't accurately represent the past, where certain kings and rulers and invaders seem to have been glorified at the cost of others.
इतिहास लिखने वालों ने साम्राज्यों का जब भी जिक्र आया तो मुगल साम्राज्य की ही चर्चा करी। हमने टीका टिप्पणी छोड़कर हमारे गौरवशाली इतिहास को जनता के सामने रखना चाहिए, इस पर संदर्भ ग्रंथों की रचना करनी चाहिए। धीरे 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 कर जो इतिहास हम मानते हैं गलत है वो अपने आप निकल जाएगा, सत्य फिर से उजागर हो जाएगा।
So, like I said, this wasn't very revelatory. I mean, the changes here didn't come across as a surprise to me, given how often we hear political leaders of the BJP party talking about this. So, they have reduced content on achievements and milestones of different Mughal era kings. As far as Delhi Sultanate is concerned, they removed pages with regard to the expansion of the Delhi Sultanate towards South India. They've removed that. And they've even dropped a chapter called Rulers and Buildings, which essentially spoke about the architectural style that was followed during different eras. And this was sort of quite heavy as far as content on forts, tombs, and gardens built during Mughal era is concerned. So that chapter has also been dropped. But yeah, this section, again, like I said, was easy to do, because it seemed like the government's always been unhappy about history textbooks and that they have made changes to quote-unquote correct history, or rather not emphasize so much on certain rulers at the cost of others.
Now, removing parts about Mughal history and even references to the Gujarat riots makes sense for the current ruling party. And what perhaps also makes sense is removing large chunks about protests and social movements, especially considering the way the current administration has clamped down on protesters in the recent past. But what is curious is that parts about the emergency have also been removed, even though they had first been introduced under the Congress regime, which should arguably be the one to be embarrassed about it. So to understand why this portion has been removed, we spoke to political commentator Dr. Suhas Palshikar and founder of Swaraj India and sociologist Yogendra Yadav, both of whom were actually part of the committee that was in charge of designing the course and writing the political science textbooks of the NCERT for classes 9 to 12. Now, Dr. Palshikar says that at one level, the bit about emergency is surprising. But when one looks deeper, it seems natural for the government to do that.
Because while the emergency is a very useful ploy to criticize the Congress party, the larger thinking of the government, the present government, is in tune with the logic of emergency, which is a hard state and a harsh state. So the government wants to use this state power to clamp down upon all citizen initiatives, including the protest movements. And therefore the reference to emergency or the chapter on emergency has been dropped. This is in a sense what one can call a statist approach that the government has adopted. And through that approach, the government wants the children to understand that obedience is an important value, not democratic debate. And therefore, a kind of approach to emergency chapter is based on not just the short-term considerations, but a long-term viewpoint of the government.
And Yogendra Yadav makes a similar point as well. He says that this portion has been removed because leaders in the current regime see themselves in those events.
You know, you read about what's being done to press in emergency, and then you realize, oh my God, it sounds like what's happening today. You read about demolitions in Turkman Gate. It reminds you of something that's happened in Delhi a few weeks ago. But basically, you don't want future citizens of this country to develop a critical sense of authoritarianism if this is what you are cultivating in the country right now. That, I think, is the heart of the matter. This is what makes them uncomfortable. I mean, otherwise, there can't possibly be any other reason.
Yadav says that when designing these textbooks, the committee first and foremost wanted to change the boring way in which political science was taught, which back then was called civics.
And civics was one of the most boring, one of the most preachy and descriptive kind of subject. And we thought that our challenge, people of this generation may not have seen that, but if you are aware of how it was taught in my generation, the civics books were really dreadful. India is a deeply political society. People take interest in politics. Everyone has an opinion on politics. In a society like this, why should books about politics be so dreadful and boring? So our challenge was to make them relatable, make them attractive to look at. So some of the changes that we brought about had nothing to do with those things that made controversies.
He says the idea was that they wanted to speak to students and not talk at them.
These are not children. These are young adults. Some of them were about to become voters. So we stopped treating them as kids. We started treating them as young adults who we need to share something with.
He says to do this, they made sure that their personal opinions don't corrupt the text. And what was included in the books was factual and well-rounded.
So we have to be factual. We would not editorialize. Our political preferences would not dominate. And that more than one versions of every single thing that we discuss will be presented. And we also then made a rule for ourselves that we would not get into details of what happened in the last 10 years, because that we thought was too close for us to get into details of.
So with this in mind, they chose to include some key topics and political events that took place in India after independence. Dr. Palshikar says that this was based on just how relevant these events were.
Emergency or Gujarat riots or the attack on the Sikhs in 1984 are some such moments that in a sense signify a challenge to India's democratic politics, and therefore these cannot be avoided. If you are teaching contemporary politics, let's say politics after independence, then these are landmarks. Question is not whether they are good or bad. The question is whether they are landmarks or not, whether they have long-term implications for understanding Indian politics. It was this viewpoint. As to caste, I think the sociology textbook similarly believes that caste and caste-related inequalities are so central that you cannot wish them away simply by not mentioning them or mentioning them in a very light manner in a textbook.
Now, by removing these parts, Yadav says that the government is actually in a way going back to the way those old civic textbooks used to be,
where reading about politics was an uncritical engagement with constitution, simple adoration of the regime, and you were taught as a good citizen, this is what you should do.
And when we talk about the reason why the current government feels the need to do this, Dr. Palshikar says that there is an ideological difference between the logic of the textbooks and the ideological approach of the BJP.
Pedagogically, it means developing a critical ability among the students after reading the textbooks. And this is exactly what the government doesn't want to do or want to happen. My real surprise is, however, that the government took so long to do this and also has been doing it in such a clumsy manner. One would have expected the government to come up with a new curriculum framework earlier and start writing new textbooks. They haven't been able to do that. And instead of writing new textbooks, they are tinkering with the existing textbooks left and right.
He also says it is difficult to believe in the arguments of the government, or that this exercise should not be seen through an ideological lens. And he says that this is because to drop an entire topic or a chapter means that you are undermining the balance and the importance between the different topics of the textbooks.
And therefore, it is very difficult to believe in this argument. Also, this has not happened only to political science textbooks. It has happened to history textbooks, where a particular logic is adopted in undermining a certain way of looking at history. The same has happened to sociology as well. And that's why I said that this is a larger question of government's approach to social sciences as a whole. I think this haphazard use of the power to chop off chapters or verses or paragraphs is not the right way of handling textbooks. And therefore, an overhaul after 15 years is possible, but that should be done in a thoroughly academic and professional manner rather than being politically motivated.
He says because of these current deletions, future students will find it very difficult to develop critical thinking, which he says lies at the heart of these textbooks. Though Yogendra Yadav is slightly more optimistic and says he sees a silver lining behind this dark cloud.
You know, young citizens discover politics in multiple ways. Political science textbooks are only a very small component of that. So while they do think, like all authoritarian regimes do, that by controlling textbooks, by controlling media, by controlling these things, they can control thought, they can shape the manner in which citizens think. I think they would discover that ordinary people have multiple ways of forming judgments. Just as secular historians thought that by writing wonderful secular textbooks, they had erased communalism from this country, only to discover that it came back in ways that they never expected. Similarly, those who think that by erasing these things, they have erased democratic consciousness, it might come back to bite them.
Okay, so now we return to the present, and with us is Ritika Chopra. Ritika, when we had spoken about this 10 months back, we were talking about the changes that were going to be made. And now those changes have been made and those textbooks are out in the market. And it turns out that you have discovered that even more changes have been made to these textbooks. So tell us, what have you found out now?
So there were three things that I noticed, essentially, which were different, or let's call them new. Although NCERT would disagree, they don't think these changes are new. So the first two were pertaining to Mahatma Gandhi and the events leading up to his assassination. And the third was pertaining to Gujarat riots. So last year in June, when NCERT finalized a list of changes, it had deleted 2 references to the Gujarat riots. And when I say references, these were fairly detailed references about events leading up to the riots, what happened after that, the political controversy around it. And there was one surviving reference in a social science textbook of class 11. This time around, when I was going through the textbooks again, I noticed that lone surviving reference, detailed reference to the Gujarat riot has now also been dropped from the sociology textbook. And that's not part of the table or the formal announcement notification from last year.
So that means now there are absolutely no references to the Gujarat riots in these textbooks.
Yes, all social science textbooks from classes 6 to 12 have been purged of any details about the Gujarat riots.
Okay, so this was about the Gujarat riots. What has been removed about Mahatma Gandhi?
So that, to me, of course, I mean, Gujarat riots, yes, is glaring enough, but because I had already covered that bit, wasn't too surprised. What I was really surprised about were the two changes pertaining to the section on the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. So in the class 12 political science textbook called Politics in India Since Independence, there was one whole page, and that segment was titled Mahatma's Sacrifice. And under that, like I said, that it speaks about events leading up to his death. And there, curiously, I noticed that there were roughly about 2 paragraphs dropped from that section. And on closer scrutiny, I realized that there was one paragraph, or at least 3 to 4 sentences, has been dropped. So this is how the paragraph starts. It talks about Mahatma Gandhi being disliked by extremists on both sides. And from this point on, I'm talking about the stuff that has been dropped, is that he was particularly disliked by the Hindu extremists because they did not like his idea of India, which is India for both Hindus and Muslims. And they were in favor of a state like Pakistan, which is just for Muslims, and that his idea of Hindu-Muslim unity irked them so much that they tried assassinating him multiple times. So this reference of Gandhi's very difficult relationship with the Hindu extremists has been dropped. And after that, it immediately jumps to the fact that on 30th of January, 1948, he's assassinated by Nathuram Godse. So just that one sentence is retained. And immediately after that, there's the last paragraph where the textbook talks about the aftermath, as in what happened after he died. And the reader is told that his death had some sort of a miraculous effect on communal tensions in the country. The government cracked down on organizations that were spreading communal hatred, and one of those organizations was the RSS. This paragraph, which talks about government's crackdown on certain organizations and the subsequent ban on the RSS, has been dropped. So these were 2 big things on that one page which jumped out for me. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it's not part of the table which was released officially by the NCERT. So this was actually, I count this as one reference pertaining to Gandhi's assassination. The second one, of course, was just 2 words and a sentence dropped from a class 12 history textbook, which describes Nathuram Godse as a Brahmin from Pune. So the phrase a Brahmin from Pune has been dropped. And the subsequent description, basically describing him as the editor of an extremist newspaper, that's also been dropped.
And what does the NCERT have to say about why it didn't publish these changes last year?
So yeah, I did have a very long chat with the director where for a very long time, I think we just disagreed on the fact on whether these changes were announced last year or not. But I think, manage to eventually convince him that, look, this is not part of the tables that you released last year. So what changed? And why should we not consider them as new? But he insisted that these are part of the last year's rationalization exercise. And if they are not actually mentioned in the table, then he attributed that to oversight. That maybe it's just oversight that we didn't announce that last year. So that's their official position, that there's nothing new to it. This was done last year. We have just only implemented these changes. And if you don't see it as part of our official announcement last year, maybe we just forgot to mention it.
And Ritika, as someone who writes on education, what is it that you want to know from the government regarding these changes?
I mean, at this point, NCERT's constant refrain is that, look, we consulted experts and this all has been done on the advice of subject experts, dadas in their sector. I think maybe the government, given that there's just been so much controversy, frankly, some of the changes in the name of rationalization is just not making sense. So I think the government should just come clean on the process followed. Because that's a bit of a black box at this point. We don't know how many consultations happened. And frankly, just if they can answer this simple question that why would you drop a few sentences describing Gandhiji's difficult relationship with Hindu extremism and how the deletion of that phrase really helps lessen the curriculum burden of a student. So if they can just come clean on the process followed, given that it's the same body which has been so open about the consultation process followed for the drafting of the National Curriculum Framework. So if you can be that open about another document, then why can't you tell us what's the rationale? Because at this moment, all we are constantly being told is that experts, consultation, but who are these experts? And how do you justify the dropping of the very selective nature of some of the deletions, like one word, one adjective? how does that really serve your purpose of helping in recovery of learning that was disrupted by the pandemic?
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.